Today, the fork is forgettable. It sits beside your plate, it pierces food, it disappears into the background of daily life. No one debates it, no one questions it. It is as neutral as a spoon. But in medieval Europe, the fork was controversial, suspicious, even sinful. When the fork first appeared in parts of Western Europe, religious leaders condemned it as an unnecessary luxury. Some called it an insult to God. Others believed it symbolized vanity and moral decay. One cleric reportedly declared that God had already given humans natural forks, their fingers, and to replace them was to reject divine design. In some regions, forks were associated with the devil because of their shape, because of their sharp prongs, because of what they represented. So how did a simple eating utensil trigger moral outrage in Christian Europe? To answer that, we have to look beyond the dinner table, into Byzantium, into the politics of marriage, and into a medieval worldview where even small objects carried spiritual meaning. Before forks were ordinary, they were foreign, and foreign things were often dangerous. The fork was not invented in medieval Western Europe. It arrived there as an import. Two-pronged eating forks had been used in parts of the Byzantine Empire and the Middle East centuries before Western Europeans encountered them. In Constantinople, small personal forks were sometimes used by the elite to handle sticky or sauced foods, particularly at refined court banquets. They were not common among peasants. They were symbols of refinement. In the 11th century, one of the most famous early appearances of the fork in Western Europe came through marriage. When a Byzantine princess married into the Venetian elite, she reportedly brought with her golden forks, delicate two-pronged utensils used at the dining table. To Venetian observers, this was strange. Most people in Western Europe ate with knives, spoons, and their hands. Bread acted as a kind of edible plate. Touching food was normal. It was communal. It was intimate. The fork disrupted that rhythm. It introduced distance between hand and food. It looked foreign. And foreign customs, especially from the Eastern Christian world, were often viewed with suspicion in Latin Europe. The fork was not just a tool, it was a cultural signal, and signals could be threatening. The resistance to forks was not only about habit, it was theological. When the Byzantine princess who used golden forks later fell ill and died, some clergy interpreted it as divine punishment. Her use of delicate utensils was described as vanity, excessive refinement in a world that valued humility. One church figure is said to have argued that God, in his wisdom, had already provided humans with natural forks, their fingers. To replace them with metal prongs was to imply divine design was insufficient. That idea mattered in medieval Europe. The world was understood as intentional, ordered by God. Every element had purpose. Hands were not merely biological, they were theological. Eating with one's fingers was not primitive, it was natural, God-given. The fork, by contrast, felt artificial. It placed cold metal between the body and sustenance. It created distance. It suggested discomfort with physical contact. And its shape did not help. Two sharp prongs resembled miniature spears, or to some, demonic imagery associated with pitchforks. In a deeply symbolic culture, objects were rarely neutral. The fork began to represent excess, foreign influence, and spiritual arrogance, not because it was dangerous, but because it challenged something older. And older traditions are rarely surrendered quietly. Beyond religion, the fork triggered something else: class anxiety. In medieval Europe, eating was communal. Large platters were shared, hands tore bread, passed meat, dipped into sauces. Meals reinforced hierarchy, but they also reinforced proximity. The fork disrupted that rhythm. It was personal, individual, precise, and most importantly, it was expensive. Early forks were often made of precious metals and owned by elites. To use one was to signal refinement, and refinement could look like arrogance. In societies where social order was rigid, visible markers of status mattered. When an object crossed borders from Byzantium into Italian courts, it carried foreign prestige, and prestige invites resentment. Some critics mocked the fork as unnecessary luxury. Others associated it with moral softness. Eating delicately seemed suspicious in cultures that valued toughness and visible appetite. There was also a practical issue. Many European foods, thick stews, roasted meats, trenchers of bread, were not designed for forks. The tool felt awkward in everyday settings, so resistance persisted. The fork remained confined to certain regions of Italy for centuries. In much of Europe, it was ignored or ridiculed. It would take hundreds of years before the utensil escaped controversy, not because it changed, but because society did. The fork did not win by argument. It won by manners. In Renaissance Italy, especially in wealthy city-states like Florence and Venice, elite culture began to shift. Dining became more performative. Court life required restraint, posture, elegance. Food presentation changed too. Pasta, for example, became more common in refined settings. Long strands of noodles were far easier to manage with a fork than with fingers. Gradually, practicality began to outweigh suspicion. But the deeper shift was cultural. By the 16th century, Europe was developing new ideas about civility. Manuals on etiquette began circulating, books that taught nobles how to sit, speak, gesture, and eat properly. Cleanliness became a visible marker of refinement. Touching food directly began to look less natural and more uncultured. The fork suddenly fit the new ideal. It created distance between hand and meal. It signaled control over appetite. It turned eating into choreography. When Catherine de' Medici married into the French court in the 1500s, she helped popularize Italian dining customs, including the fork, among French elites. From there, the utensil slowly spread, not because the church endorsed it, not because critics apologized, but because power adopted it. And when power changes its habits, society eventually follows. The fork was never truly about metal prongs. It was about change. In medieval Europe, objects carried moral weight. To alter something as intimate as eating was to alter tradition, hierarchy, even theology. The fork arrived as foreign technology. It looked strange. It felt unnecessary. It disrupted habit. So it became dangerous. Religious leaders framed it as vanity. Critics mocked it as weakness. Some associated it with demonic imagery. But over time, what was once condemned became civilized. What was once sinful became standard. The fork story reveals something consistent in history. New tools often trigger moral panic, not because they are harmful, but because they symbolize a shift in power, identity, or control. The fork created distance between hand and food, but it also marked distance from the past. Today, it feels invisible, neutral, obvious. Yet for centuries, it represented foreign influence, class tension, and spiritual anxiety. A small object, a large reaction, and a reminder that even the simplest tools can threaten a worldview.